Hi, welcome to the book of Deuteronomy. You have been making your way through the Torah material, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and now you come to what is really a crucial book to understand, not just for itself, of course, as being a book in the Word of God, but because, as you will see, Deuteronomy is a key to understanding well so much of the rest of the Old Testament. The history books, which are in the Jewish Torah is understood as the former prophets, these books all connect to and come out of the book of Deuteronomy. And then when you come to the prophets, they are speaking again out of the law, and especially connecting to the book of Deuteronomy with the blessings and curses. Now, all of this we will explore more as we go through this particular teaching. But just first of all, let's consider the setting. They had just gone through the 40 years of wandering through the wilderness. Actually, it's 38 years if you think of the 2 years from the deliverance of Egypt to Sinai, all that happened at Sinai, and then the wandering because of the failure to possess the land. And so with Deuteronomy, what we're actually dealing with is a new generation of people. You remember in Numbers when they failed to enter the land because of unbelief, the consequence of that was that Israel was to wander in the wilderness until all of those soldiers, all of the army, those men that were involved in that particular failure to enter the land, until they had died. And then when they had died, there was still people who were below the army age, and there would have been also women who were still alive from the original group. But what we really have is a new generation. And this new generation now were about to go in and possess the land. And if we think of the physical location, if you look at the map, what you'll see is that the people of Israel were encamping on the east of the Jordan, just above the Dead Sea, and around about Mount Nebo. Just for your interest, we have here a satellite photograph. It's a well-known image, of course, with the Jordan Rift Valley and the Dead Sea. And there marked is the location of Israel where they were camping about there when Deuteronomy, this event happened. If you just look across there, you'll see the other blue mark there. That is where Jericho was. And if you look at the topography, you'll see that the land there rises very steeply to the Judean hill country. And of course, Jericho was guarding the pass up into the rest of the land. And so when we come to Joshua, we're going to see how, first of all, Jericho is tackled, and then the way was open. But right now, we are with the group of Israel that were on the east of the Jordan. They had gone through 38 years of wandering, and now they were ready to enter in. But of course, it was going to be a time of a transition of leadership. Moses was going to die. Joshua was going to be appointed and anointed to carry on with this particular task of entering the land. And so in Deuteronomy, we have a number of things going on. We do have Moses giving what would be his last speech, his last testimony to the people before he dies, and Joshua takes over. But it's also the renewing of a covenant with this new generation. Now, Deuteronomy literally means second law. And that's kind of an unfortunate title, because it's not a second law, but it's a restating of the covenant, the law that was given at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19 and following. And so in Exodus 19, what we have is God entering into a covenant with Israel. Now, I want us to reflect on that for a few moments, because how we understand what happened in Exodus really is important for us to get the right set of glasses, the right spectacles to look at this particular genre of literature. So just go back there with me and imagine how this group of people, they entered Egypt as 70 people, a family of 70. And over those hundreds of years, that family grew to become an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people. And as they grew, they would have continued to have had their tribal connections, the different tribal groupings, the different clans and extended families. But of course, the persecution, the oppression of slavery, we know from Exodus, was very awful for them, and they were crying out for deliverance. And then, of course, you know the story there: Moses at the burning bush, commissioned by God, and all of the wonderful deliverance. And so, when the Exodus happened and this group of people moved from Egypt through the wilderness to Mount Sinai, what happened there was very important to understand. Because when they came there, they were going through a process where God was taking this group of refugees, is exactly what they were, taking this group of refugees and bringing a transition from that state into a people that were prepared for nationhood. You know that they could have reached the promised land very quickly. It would have taken 10 days or a couple of weeks to get from Egypt to the southern border of the promised land. But God, in His wisdom, did something different. He took them all the way through the wilderness to Mount Sinai. And in chapter 19 of Exodus, we see God entering into a covenant with the people. In Exodus 19, we read how God was saying to them, I am the God who indeed brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. I bore you on eagle's wings, this beautiful picture of God delivering the people out of Egypt. And He said to them that all the nations of the earth are mine, but you will be to me a special people, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And in that, He was commissioning Israel to be indeed His representatives in the earth. In the same way as a priest represents a people to God and God to the people, so God was intending Israel to be a nation as a whole that represents Him to the nations and the nations to Him. All the nations of the earth are mine, He says, but you will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You will be my special people. And then you'll remember, He said to them, if you keep my covenant. And you'll remember how the response of the people was, we will keep your covenant. There was even a covenant meal in chapter 24, where the elders of Israel, the leaders of the different tribes, they went up the mountain of God and they had a covenant meal together. We read about that. And also in chapter 20, we find God then gives Israel the 10 Commandments. And those 10 Commandments are the foundation of their national life. Often we think of the Ten Commandments as an individual thing, and I'm sure that's not wrong. But for Israel at this time, this became the foundation of their nationhood, and it was a foundation of how they were to actually govern their country. And so the thing I want us to get from here is that God was entering into a covenant relationship with them, and what he was doing was actually giving them their constitution. So as a tribe or a group of people that were refugees in the language of today, they weren't poor refugees. You'll remember that they despoiled Egypt when they came out. It's as if the hundreds of years of free labor, they finally received the payment for that. They despoiled the Egyptians and they came out very wealthy. Lots of herds and animals and gold and silver and expensive clothing. They were certainly very wealthy, but they were refugees in the sense that they had no country at this time, but they had no government system either. All of the instruments of government, they didn't have that. And so when God gives them the covenant, what he's actually doing is giving them those instruments, those institutions needed for governing of a country. And you'll notice the different categories that are addressed. The category of course, their religion and how they should worship. This was foundational for Israel, because in Egypt they had been involved in a society that was completely pagan. The Egyptian gods are well known. You can research this very easily on Google. Many different gods, and those gods were all connected to different spheres of and areas of society and of life. And therefore they were used to being involved in such idolatry. In the tragedy of the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, you'll remember when they thought Moses had died, they immediately thought of creating an idol. That was the way their mind was set, and that's the way it went. And the reason for that was their background. But as they were entering into a covenant with the one true living God, then they had to relearn all about how to operate and how the religious practices should be. And so there's a lot of space in the constitution that God gave Israel for the religious life of their nation. But also there's other laws. You find that there's what today we will call criminal laws, or there would be laws related to the civil life. There's a lot about economics. There's a lot about family, education, social structures to protect the vulnerable. All of these things are part of the covenant that God gave Israel. And we will be exploring these more as we go through the book of Deuteronomy. Now, I want to take a bit of time to talk about this, the particular kind of covenant that God gave Israel. We need to understand this because this becomes a foundation upon which the rest of the Old Testament is built. So when it comes to covenants, I think understand that concept. And in Scripture, even up to this point of the Old Testament, we do find different kinds of covenants. The one that we're most familiar with is technically known as a parity covenant. And this is a covenant when people of equal standing come, negotiate an agreement, and then commit to that agreement. This kind of covenant is seen when Abraham and Abimelech come together. You remember that Abraham had a growing wealth. He would have been, I guess today, understood as a sheik with a huge family and flocks and servants and a great big household. And of course, all of those, they need to drink water. And back then, even as in places today, the most important thing was clean water to drink. Well, there was another local chief, Abimelech. He's known as a king, a tribal king, but he also had flocks and herds and of course a lot of people. And therefore, wells that gave good water, they were the thing that could bring tremendous conflict. And what you see in a couple of times with Abraham and also Isaac, that they come together to negotiate a peace agreement over water. And as they come together, they negotiate together, they have an agreement, and then there's a ceremony. There's always a ceremony to confirm the covenant that they made. And it often involved a sacrifice of an animal. So there was blood involved. But then the animal would be prepared for food, and there would be a meal involved. And so this agreement was confirmed with a very definite act. And then sometimes there was a symbol, maybe a rock or something that symbolized the covenant. And so we see this in Scripture, we see this in daily life. I guess a marriage is that kind of covenant. Two people coming together freely, committing to the marriage vows. And then there's often a ring or something as a symbol, and there's usually a meal as well, a wedding supper, a wedding celebration, reception. And so we're familiar with that kind of covenant, the parity covenant, a covenant between people of equal standing. The second kind of covenant we come across is, again, we're familiar with this, but it's known as a promissory covenant. A promissory covenant is more of a one-sided covenant where someone promises and commits themselves to that promise to do something for someone else. The closest example in modern life is probably when someone makes a will. When they write their will and testimony, they make a commitment through a legal entity that when they die, certain things will happen, and their estate should be divided in different ways to different people. There's a beneficiary of that covenant, and there's the person who makes that covenant. And very often it's a one-sided deal. Now, of course, we know that wills vary, and sometimes there's conditions put in, but very often it's just a statement of what will happen with their estate. And this is known as a promissory covenant. And we see this echoed in, for example, Genesis 15. You remember that Abraham was going through one of those challenges of faith, how he was being discouraged because there was no heir as promised. The descendants that had been promised wasn't happening, but also the land promise as well. These two promises that come from Genesis 12 to have descendants and land, they weren't happening. You remember how God took him out. It was obviously in the evening, at night, showed in the stars of heaven and affirmed the promise that his descendants would be like that. But then regarding the land, you remember he said to Abraham that you are to take these animals and you're to cut them in half, and this was sometimes how covenants were made. It's very graphic. An animal was literally cut in half, and the two people who were making the covenant will walk through the pieces of that separated dead animal. And what they're really saying is I make a covenant with you, and if I break my side of the covenant, then you're to do to me what we've done to this animal. And if you break your side of the covenant, you need to watch out, because I will do to you what we have done to this animal. And so it's a very vivid illustration of a covenant situation. And that is what God told Abraham to do. To take these animals and to divide them. And then you'll remember something strange happened. Abraham went into a deep sleep, we read. And then there was a flaming torch and a pot of fire, and these two items moved through the pieces of these animals. Now, of course, there's lots of questions connected to this, but the point is that it wasn't Abraham and a flaming torch that moved through the pieces of this animal, but rather it was two items that were representing God himself. And so it's as if God was making a covenant with himself that he would indeed fulfill this promise to Abraham. And it was a one-sided covenant, a one-sided commitment. There was no two people, but rather God making a vow on himself. And so that is a good example of what we would call a promissory covenant, whereby it's a one-sided covenant. And so we see these two forms of covenant, which we even today have reflected in different ways in our own society. But there's a third kind, and this is very unfamiliar to us. And this is the kind of covenant we see made in Exodus 19, the kind of covenant that is restated in Deuteronomy, and it's that I want to take a few moments to talk about now. This covenant is known as a suzerainty covenant. So, what is a suzerainty covenant? This is a whole different kind of covenant that we're not used to today. We're used to examples of people entering into an agreement between equals, whether it's marriage, as I gave an example, or whether it's a business arrangement. This is common. We're familiar too with what is known as a promissory covenant. This is someone maybe making a will or a commitment that is just their own decision. But the suzerainty covenant is something that is very different. It really, as far as we understand, was born out of the Hittite Empire. The Hittites were a big empire round about the time of Abraham. Their home was what today would be southern eastern Turkey, and they built an empire out of that location. They did it in a really clever way. So let's talk about this. This covenant is known as a suzerainty covenant because it is a covenant between a suzerain. A suzerain is a powerful king, and a vassal. A vassal is a name given to the defeated king. And so you have the suzerain, who is the great empire builder. You have the vassal, who is that defeated king. Sometimes this is known as a vassal treaty. It comes by two different names. Suzerainty treaty or a vassal treaty is the same thing. Now, let's understand how this emerged. Just imagine with me that we have a city-state. What I mean by a city-state is a city that would have a king, and then that king would control the land for a certain radius around that city. It would have villages. It may even have some other smaller cities. but there would be a king, and then just away over a few hills there may be another city-state. In other words, very small kingdoms. We see this in the book of Joshua. When you come to Joshua, you will see how he conquered a number of different kings in the southern part and the northern part of the Promised Land. And they were kings of city-states. And so to think, when we go back to this period of time, we don't have the kind of national think of today, but these smaller kingdoms, at least in this part of the world. So just imagine with me for a few moments that we have a city, we call it a brown city, and this city had a king and he controlled the land around. And then a few hills over we have a purple city, and the purple city, they had their king and he controlled the different cities, different villages around, and the people, and they would have all worked and worked the land, and then they would have harvested it, and the king would have taken probably the giant share of what they produce. That was often the Canaanite way and the way of these kings. But and let's just imagine that they were peaceful together and they would trade together, the people of these different cities. And then we have a situation where there's a change of a king in one of those cities, and he's a very ambitious young king. And as he looks at his kingdom, and as he looks at the kingdom over there, the king and the kingdom over there, he evaluates that his army is stronger than their army, and so what he decides to do is not trade with them, but he's going to actually attack them and conquer them. And so this is what happens. He conquers the city and is able to scale the wall and all of the siege warfare and all of that, which is so common throughout so much of history. And when he conquers that city, he actually has a couple of choices. Very often in those scenarios, what the conquering king will do is destroy the army of the other king, maybe take all of the people to be slaves, burn the city, break it down, take all of the plunder they can find, the gold and the silver, the expensive clothing, diamonds, jewels, all of the treasures. And as I say, the people will be maybe sold into slavery or become slaves, and the city is destroyed. And then that king, the conquering king, then has all of that extra wealth and extra plunder, and the cattle and the sheep and all of the livestock. The people of that city, they become richer. The soldiers are rewarded, and that is a particular scenario which has happened over and over again in history. But it seems that the Hittites, they actually had a different idea. That when they conquered a city, rather than destroying the city, destroying the king and the people, what they did was they actually entered into a covenant relationship with the defeated king and the defeated people. And in that arrangement, the defeated king, the vassal, was allowed to continue to rule his city. The people were allowed to continue to live and do their farming and all of the other things that they would do. But they had to pay tribute every year to the suzerain, to the victorious king. And in this way, the victorious king, rather than getting a one-time benefit from defeating that city, was rewarded every year with the wealth and the produce that has been created by the defeated city. And so this seems to be something that the Hittites did when they built their kingdom. But what we have developed is an arrangement that was really quite complex, because the suzerain would stipulate the terms of a covenant, and the vassal would have to agree to that covenant. And those stipulations, as we will see, were very detailed. One of the things, for example, was the army of the vassal. That army would be left intact. All of their war machine would not be destroyed, but rather the suzerain would require the vassal to bring his army and to make the army of the suzerain even bigger. And so therefore they would be able to grow as a military force and do greater exploits. One of the fascinating comments in the book of Jeremiah is that God said to Jeremiah in a prophetic word that the kings of the nations would set up their thrones outside the gates of Jerusalem. This is when the Babylonians attacked in 586 BC. And the reason that would be the case is because the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, who was a suzerain of this particular kind, a man that had built a great empire, Nebuchadnezzar, he had his army made up of his own Chaldean troops, but also of the different kings of his defeated cities and their armies too. And so we see that this was a very common concept. The suzerainty treaty wasn't between equals, or it wasn't like a promissory covenant, but rather it was a covenant whereby the suzerain stipulated the terms of the covenant, and the vassal, he really had a choice. He either accepted them or rejected them. The problem is, of course, if he rejected them, he would be executed and someone would be found to take his place. And so he had a choice, but not really any choice. The terms of the covenant were stated. And so this understanding of the suzerainty covenant, it was an understanding that was very familiar to the people at the time of Moses. Very familiar. There was all around, they would have seen this particular dynamic happening. And so when God was going to enter into a relationship with Israel, when he was going to take them from a group of slaves and transition them into a people who were going to be a nation and have a land, what kind of government organization, or what kind of situation did he give them? He didn't give them a republic or a parliamentary democracy. These are national concepts that developed an awful lot later. Rather, what God did was he took an arrangement that was familiar to them 3,500 years ago. He took this particular arrangement, and what he did was, it's like he cleaned it up and he dusted it off, and he used this kind of situation with them. Now, the suzerains of the nations around, they were very barbaric, very cruel as they built their empire, very violent. And if you broke the covenant, then you really were in trouble. And so we know that that was the situation with the Hittites and later the Assyrians and the Babylonians. But what we have with God, as he chose Israel and brought them to himself, we have a suzerain of a whole different nature, a whole different kind of situation. Rather than violent and cruel, we have a suzerain who wanted the very best for this people. a suzerain who loved the people. And as we're going to see in Deuteronomy, every stipulation in the covenant he made with Israel was for the benefit and the blessing and the prospering of the people. It was always for their good and not the good of himself. But nonetheless, it was this framework that God used, a framework that was known to Israel, a framework that they would have understood, and he entered into covenant with them. And that is why in Deuteronomy 19, God says, if you keep my covenant. He doesn't say, if you keep our covenant, but rather, if you keep my covenant, you will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. All the nations of the earth are mine, he says, but you will be to me a treasured people. And so, when it comes to God's covenant with Israel that was made in Exodus 19:20 and following, that covenant that is renewed in Deuteronomy, it is this kind of covenant that we're talking about. It is as if God took this understanding that was well known and, as I said, cleaned it up, adjusted it, but then that becomes the framework of his relationship with Israel. God is the benevolent, merciful, kind suzerain, and Israel were becoming like the vassal that would enter into a relationship. And God said over and over again that if you keep my covenant, then you will be a blessed people, you will be protected, you will be prospered, and you will be safe. But as we're going to see, if they did not keep his covenant, then there would be disciplines that would come upon the people for that very reason. And so, as we think of this covenant, what we discover is that the covenants that we have found in archaeology, that have been unearthed in the Middle East there, these covenants, they all have a specific, particular framework. When through archaeology these stone tablets were found and they were able to decipher the language, read what the text of these items said, they discovered what we today call the suzerainty treaty or the vassal treaty. And what they discovered is that these documents were very well thought out. In fact, they all had the same kind of structure. And firstly, they had what the scholars called the preamble of the document. And the preamble was often an introduction of the suzerain. It would just say who he was. It would often have a lot about how great he was and the great accomplishments that he had performed. But particularly, it was identifying the suzerain. And then this agreement would go on to talk about what the scholars have called the historical prologue. And that is, it would talk about the relationship between the suzerain and the vassal. Now, this may be because of the defeat of the vassal in war, but sometimes this particular arrangement was not used out of conflict, but sometimes it was used with the vassal wanting protection. We actually see this in the book of Kings and Isaiah. Later on in Israel's history, there was a king you will get to meet in the book of Kings called Ahaz. Ahaz was in a very difficult position. He was being attacked by Syria and by Israel, the northern kingdom. And so Ahaz, this king of Judah, rather than trusting God, that Isaiah told him to do, What he actually did was went to the king of Assyria, and he voluntarily became a vassal. Now, the reason he would do that was because then Assyria, as part of their covenant agreement, Assyria would actually protect him and protect his throne. So although he was a vassal needing to pay tribute every year and fulfill other requirements, he was safe on his throne because of the protection of this bigger kingdom. And so this covenant relationship was entered in and became very well known, as I said, and there were always different angles to it. And so the historical prologue would often talk about the series of events that led up to this particular covenant being made. Either the defeat of the vassal and the benevolence of the suzerain in allowing the vassal to live and all that may be involved with that. This is the kind of thing, or maybe like Ahaz's situation where the vassal actually went to the suzerain for protection. Whatever led up to this particular covenant would be in the historical prologue. Once this has been worked through, we then have the covenant stipulations. And this here is basically what the suzerain requires of the vassal. We will have some examples of those things in a few minutes, but this is, if you like, the heart of the covenant agreement. But then there is a part that is in every one of these covenants, and it's known as the blessings and the curses. You see, there were consequences to the vassal obeying or not obeying the covenant. If the vassal obeys the covenant, then there were benefits for him that would be there. If he disobeyed the covenant, then the suzerain was laying out the consequences of disobedience. And these are done in detail, often in these pagan documents. There's a calling upon the gods of the suzerain to be involved, but basically there would be a price to pay if the vassal disobeys. Now, when you understand how big this particular covenant arrangement is, you actually see this worked out in so much of the rest of the Old Testament. When you come to the Assyrian period, for example, it was this kind of arrangement that the Assyrian kings had with Judah and with Israel. And you see that when the kings of Judah or Israel rebelled against the Assyrians or the Babylonians, then there was always an attack that happened, the cities were laid siege, the king was executed, or all sorts of different things happened. And this is because this was part of that covenant arrangement, that of the blessings and of the curses. And then usually at the end there's a portion known as covenant continuity. And this is to ensure that the covenant arrangement goes beyond just one generation. And so it will make provision that if the vassal dies, the son and heir of the vassal is automatically included in this covenant arrangement. And if the suzerain dies, then this covenant arrangement continues beyond the one suzerain, but also to their heir as well. And so you can see that these covenants were well thought through and transitioned just one particular generation. And so this particular outline is something that is common to the different covenants that have been found. Now, on the screen there, you see an example of a vassal treaty or a suzerainty treaty with an Assyrian king. This is later than Moses' time. It was around about 672 BC. and it was made with a chief of the a Median area, Ramatia. And so that's an example of what a vassal treaty, a suzerainty treaty may look like. You see that this one is broken, but nonetheless we have here the cuneiform script, and this is just an example of the ancient writing. It was made with a wedge-shaped implement into clay, or of course here there would be chisels that would chisel out the stone. But these different wedge-shaped patterns, they're letters, and thankfully there are those who are able to read this and translate it. Marvelous. This is how we're able to know so much. And so just some examples of the stipulations. So we put some feet on this thing. What kind of stipulations were involved in these treaties? Well, to bring tribute each year. That, of course, is a big one. The suzerain required the vassal to often appear personally and bow before him, or maybe allow representatives. But the thing is, they will be bringing wealth into the kingdom of the suzerain, and the suzerain would determine what that should be. And probably it was enough to make sure that the vassal remained poor, and therefore the suzerain had control. Another stipulation would be that the suzerain, the vassal, even as he entered into a covenant with the suzerain, he was not allowed to enter into the covenant with any other, anyone else, any other being. And this is something that got Judah into big trouble later on, because they had a covenant with Babylon, but then what they did was they entered into an alliance with Egypt. And of course they were looking for Egypt to bring their armies to join them and to throw off the yoke of the Babylonian suzerainty covenant, the Babylonian king. But what the suzerainty covenant would stipulate is that the vassal is not permitted to do that. There's to be no other foreign alliances. Another stipulation would be that a vassal in the orbit of the suzerain was not to fight another city in that same alliance. The suzerain didn't want his vassals fighting one another, and so there was a stipulation that they should not fight one another. Another stipulation in the covenant could be a call to arms from the suzerain. When the suzerain requires the vassal to bring his army to go to battle, then the vassal was required to do that. I've spoken about that. And then there's other things too, and this just gives you an idea of the detailed nature of these vassal treaties. And that is, if the vassal hears of rumours, negative rumours about the suzerain, or plots to attack and overthrow the suzerain, they are bound by covenant to make that information known to the suzerain. It is part of the covenant agreement. And then there were stipulations to enable the empire to operate legally. So if there was a fugitive, if there was someone who had broken the law and they ran to hide in a city for protection of the vassal, then the vassal was required to give that person up. I guess today we would call that an extradition treaty. And so there was this kind of arrangement between the different cities as well. And so you find that there were lots of stipulations like this to enable the empire to function. and a protection of the suzerain, but also there were benefits for the vassal, and so one of those would be that the suzerain would protect the throne of the vassal. So if there was an attack from a different people on the vassal, the suzerain would come and protect him. And of course, the reason he would do that is because he's protecting his own interests by protecting the vassal. But of course, it was of benefit to the vassal too. And even if, not only if there was an attack on the city, but if there was internal rebellion against the vassal, the suzerain would protect him, so he remains on the throne. And other things too. If there was a famine, then the suzerain would ensure that the people were able to eat, and again protecting his interests by enabling the vassal and that particular kingdom to flourish and grow for his own benefit. And so what we have here is this entity that was well known, as I've said, and fairly detailed and very structured, that was well known. And then what we have is God taking this, as I've said, cleaning it up, and he, the merciful, benevolent suzerain, taking this particular concept and using it as he entered into covenant relationship with Israel. Now, just one other thing connected with this is that within the covenant God gave Israel was the law code. And as I've said, this law was their constitution. It was how their nation was to function. It addresses all the different areas of society. But as you read Exodus 21 through 24, as you read the different laws in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, we don't find that the laws are grouped together in ways that we would understand today, such as property law or civil law or social order protection. We have these different categories today. That isn't the way it worked there. Often the laws were kind of all mixed up in the subject matter. And what is interesting is that is how law was given. On the screen you see a picture of this famous stone structure that is in the Louvre in France, actually, known as the Code of Hammurabi. And Hammurabi was about 300 years before Moses, and it is a law code for his people there in the Babylonian area. And people have noted the similarities between the law of Moses. Now, there's differences also, but there are definite similarities, and even an older law code, the Code of Eshuna, around about the time of Abraham. And there you can see the picture of it on the screen. These law codes have similarities to Moses. Now, what I'm saying is you can see how when God delivered Israel out of Egypt, when he brought them to Sinai to bring about the transition from refugees into a nation, he used mechanisms that were understood by them. They were relevant to their time in history, relevant to what they understood. But what we see God does is takes these things, adjusts them, changes them to serve his own purposes.